Europe trembled on May 10, 1940, as the gray dawn stretched over the Low Countries. The Wehrmacht surged west in a storm of steel and fire, unleashing the Blitzkrieg, a tempest of tanks, aircraft, and soldiers that smashed through Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The Allied High Command, still haunted by the stagnant trenches of the last Great War, scrambled columns of French, British, and Belgian troops forward, believing the Germans would attack head-on through Belgium. But Hitler's masterstroke came at Sedan. On May 13, his panzers ripped through the Ardennes, a terrain deemed impassable, and rolled across the Meuse River in less than 48 hours. Columns of refugees clogged the roads. Towns burned behind the sky's shriek, Junkers bombers swooping low over endless convoys in a ballet of terror. In the chaos, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, comprising over 400,000 men, was ordered north, anchoring around the city of Lille. Within days, Guderian's armored spearheads smashed through, racing toward the Channel, scissoring through the French defenses. On May 20th, German tanks rolled into Abbeville, splitting the Allied armies. The trap was sprung. North of the German armored thrust, the BEF, elements of the French First Army, and Belgium's last defenders found themselves pressed against the western edge of Flanders. Ahead, the steel claws of the Wehrmacht. Behind them, the open sea. Panic flickered through headquarters. Could the Navy rescue the army before the German grip tightened? Churchill, freshly appointed Prime Minister, confronted the gravest decision of his life: fight on, or surrender and risk the shadow of swastikas flying above Buckingham Palace. The clock ticked. The beaches awaited. May 21st. The thunder of distant artillery rattled shattered windows in the port city of Dunkirk. Streets were clogged with fleeing civilians, abandoned vehicles, packs of weary soldiers searching for orders, for hope. At sunrise, the BEF, battered, exhausted, retreated towards Dunkirk, their only feasible escape. The city, its port battered but still functional, became the epicenter of survival. German air raids began in earnest. Heinkel and Messerschmitt aircraft screamed through the sky, dropping bombs indiscriminately onto stone buildings, piers, and the gathering masses. Fires consumed warehouses, the acrid pall of burning oil drifted above the shoreline. Yet, between sorties, Royal Air Force Spitfires and Hurricanes clawed into the sky, dogfighting, defending the battered city in desperate, swirling combat. The beach itself was a panorama of desperation, lines of soldiers, packs on backs, stretching for miles across sand and shallow surf, staring anxiously at the horizon. The little port, its eastern mole and western jetty, was frequently targeted. Each day, the crowd swelled. Water grew scarce. Rations dwindled. French troops, exhausted, dug trenches into the dunes, bracing for the imminent assault. In one tragic episode, on May 23rd, German artillery collapsed a pier crowded with troops. But hope flickered from across the Channel. At Dover, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding Operation Dynamo from the tunnels beneath the ancient castle, received Churchill's unchanged instruction: evacuate as many as possible. Every available ship, military vessels, ferries, merchantmen, was summoned. Across Britain, a call went out for even the smallest craft. The armada of little ships began to gather. Europe braced for disaster, but history was about to unfold on the sands. May 26th. At precisely 1857 hours, Admiral Ramsay issued the first official order: Operation Dynamo was underway. On cue, destroyers, minesweepers, paddle steamers, and assorted civilian craft slipped their moorings in southern England, plunging into the restless, mine-laden waters of the Channel. Their destination, the blighted beaches and battered piers of Dunkirk, a mere 58 nautical miles across the waves. On the sand, soldiers watched in disbelief as silhouettes appeared on the horizon, transformed by sunset into a glimmering parade of hope. The evacuation, however, was fraught with peril from the outset. Luftwaffe bombers filled the sky, seeking to sink the ships on approach and destroy what remained of the port facilities. Royal Navy anti-aircraft crews fought desperately, lashing the air with a ferocious curtain of fire. Above, RAF fighters flew themselves to exhaustion, battling overwhelming odds. During the first frantic 24 hours, only 7,669 men were evacuated, a mere drop in the ocean compared to those awaiting rescue. Logistics strained under the weight of disaster, low tides hampered ships, demolished docks forced men to wade chest-deep into icy surf, clambering onto lifeboats and cutters. Many drowned. Yet, with each passing hour, more ships arrived. Among them, the motor-launch MTB-102, blazing a trail through enemy fire to deliver men and messages alike. Its captain, Lieutenant Commander Henry H. D. Goff, navigated through burning oil slicks as German bombs fell around him. As midnight tolled, Dunkirk's skies were alive with roaring engines, bursting shells, and the staccato rhythm of small arms. British military police worked tirelessly to maintain order, directing columns onto boats. French officers pleaded for priority for their beleaguered regiments. The chaos grew, but a fragile routine began to form. Each day would bring new terror and new hope. The beaches, illuminated by the fires of war, became the crucible of a nation's fate. As dawn broke on May 27th, Dunkirk awoke to a new hell. The Luftwaffe struck repeatedly, turning the port area into a smoking ruin. The eastern mole, a concrete pier intended for cargo, not masses of soldiers, became the unlikely lifeline. Against roaring surf and falling bombs, destroyers, merchant ships, and paddle steamers lined up at the mole, loading men as fast as possible. German artillery thundered day and night, shells falling indiscriminately throughout the city and onto the beaches. Fires raged. Yet, amidst destruction, acts of supreme courage unfolded. Royal Navy Commander James Campbell Clouston, a Canadian, oversaw the evacuation at the mole, surviving near misses and falling bombs to orchestrate the orderly boarding of ships. Clouston's work became legendary. On May 29th, his luck ran out, his launch was sunk by German aircraft, and he was lost to the waves. The numbers grew staggering. On May 28th, over 17,803 men were evacuated. By May 29th, 47,310 more packed onto ships. A logistical miracle achieved under ceaseless attack. Civilian craft, tugs, fishing boats, lifeboats, pleasure cruisers, braved mines and strafing runs, plucking men from the surf. Tommy Allen, skipper of the fishing boat Tamzine, made repeated runs through gunfire, ferrying scores of men to deeper draft destroyers. The RAF, often criticized for seeming absence, actually fought ferociously inland. Over 20 Spitfires and Hurricanes were lost on May 27th alone, as pilots tangled with the enemy over the approaches and corridors. Morale teetered as each bomb shook the sand. Yet, courage and order prevailed. The evacuation was working, but the enemy was closing in. May 28th. Catastrophe struck as Belgium, under King Leopold III, faced the collapse of its last defensive lines. With Antwerp lost and German troops flooding through the country, Leopold made the fateful decision to surrender. The Belgian capitulation, while sparing lives, exposed the left flank of the Dunkirk defenses. Suddenly, the perimeter was pressed inwards, shrinking with every hour. British and French commanders hastily reorganized. General Harold Alexander was appointed to supervise the rearguard, orchestrating a desperate defense of the shrinking pocket. The perimeter was drawn into a fragile arc, stretching from Newport in the west to Bray Dunes in the east, less than 10 miles across at its narrowest. The Germans pressed forward, infantry and tanks probing, snipers firing through the dunes, bitter street fighting erupting in the beleaguered suburbs. Over these days, the crescendo of Operation Dynamo, the evacuation peaked. The beaches teemed as thousands queued for a place amongst the lifeboats and launches. May 30th and 31st saw huge surges, 53,823 and 68,014 rescued respectively. Vessels filled with mud-spattered, shell-shocked soldiers navigated back and forth despite mines, torpedoes, and relentless air attack. The destroyer HMS Grenade was bombed at the mole, burning as men leapt into the water for survival. French resistance on the perimeter was fierce, buying precious hours for escape. Many would remain to fight to the last. Their sacrifice preserved the legacy of Dunkirk. Inside Britain, the nation watched anxiously, radios crackling with news and rumors. At Whitehall, Churchill drafted words to steel the people for what was to come. "We shall fight on the beaches. But still, thousands remained on the sand, gazing desperately toward the horizon. Would the miracle hold? The final days of May and the beginning of June saw the evacuation reach its staggering zenith. All manner of vessels, destroyers, small motor boats, merchant craft, even private yachts, braved the gauntlet of the Channel, battered by mines, strafing, and erratic weather. The journey itself was fraught with terror and uncertainty. For many soldiers, Dunkirk was only the beginning of another trial, a sea passage that could turn deadly at any moment. As night fell on May 30th, searchlights swept across the shoreline, guiding ships in and out despite the blackened sky and intermittent fog. On these perilous crossings, sailors and civilian volunteers bore witness to acts of humanity and heroism. Fathers and sons, fishermen and ferry captains, risked their lives for strangers, an entire nation's hope resting on their skill and bravery. Tales spread of boats barely afloat, laden so heavily that water lapped at the gunwales. Some were sunk by mines or aircraft. Survivors clung to wreckage, hoping for rescue or the chance to swim for shore. Above the waves, the Royal Air Force intensified its effort. On May 31st, No. 11 Group dispatched waves of Spitfires and Hurricanes in coordinated attacks, often too far inland for those on the beaches to witness. RAF pilots intercepted German bombers and fighters headed for Dunkirk, forcing them to jettison bombs into fields or crash landing in combat with Messerschmitts. Meanwhile, discipline on the beaches frayed. Amid cold, hunger, and exhaustion, tempers flared. Military police struggled to maintain order, organizing queues, sometimes with rifles drawn, to prevent panic. Wounded men received priority, ferried to the mole or assisted by medics. A fog of uncertainty hung over the crowd. Would they reach home or perish on foreign sand? Aboard the rescue ships, the scene was equally harrowing. Soldiers, packed shoulder to shoulder, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and constant danger, gazed at the horizon for the first sight of British shores. Some cried, others stared in silence. For many, the sound of the English language, orders shouted, encouragement offered, and even the distant bells of Dover brought relief and tears. But the battle was not yet over. The perimeter shrank further, and thousands remained. By June's dawn, the pressure on the Dunkirk pocket grew almost unbearable. German divisions closed in with renewed fury, bolstered by fresh armor and artillery. French forces, under General Georges Blanchard and later General Foucault, held the line doggedly. Their resistance would become legendary, a final stand in the battered outskirts and dunes surrounding the city. On June 1st, British rearguard units began to withdraw, leaving French regiments to cover the escape routes. Street-to-street fighting erupted in Dunkirk's edge, machine gun nests in ruined buildings, snipers waiting in shattered houses, small bands of soldiers launching counterattacks to forestall the German advance. The sacrifice was immense, with hundreds falling in last-ditch efforts to buy minutes, even seconds, for evacuation to continue. Churchill, receiving reports in London, refused to allow any relaxation. "Every hour's delay is precious," he insisted. Admiral Ramsay redoubled extraction efforts. At sea, dramatic rescues unfolded, ships overloaded, forced to depart under fire. The destroyer HMS Havant was hit by bombs on June 1st, suffering catastrophic damage. Survivors described the nightmare of fire on the decks, confused shouts, and the desperate scramble into lifeboats. As June 2nd arrived, evacuation rates slowed, a grim sign that the most organized Allied units had left. Yet more than 40,000 French troops still held out in desperate defense. Ramsay sent urgent signals, rescue as many French as possible. The Royal Navy and the fleet of little ships persisted, but German infiltration into the perimeter forced abrupt changes. New embarkation points were chosen, sometimes under direct enemy fire. On the sand, the last British units prepared for one final, perilous crossing. To the east, fires lit the dawn sky, a grim reminder that not all could be saved, no matter how great the effort. The battle for Dunkirk would close within hours. June 3rd. The Allies' time at Dunkirk was nearly at an end. Of the original 400,000, most British units had been evacuated, but tens of thousands of French and colonial troops remained. German infantry and armor now pressed directly into the city, launching a full-scale assault designed to choke off any remaining escape. In the battered ruins, French soldiers fought on amid the wreckage, sheltering behind makeshift barricades and sniping at approaching enemy patrols. The mole, so crucial till now, was nearly destroyed by bombs and shellfire. Final evacuation orders were broadcast. Only those near the shoreline or with direct access to boats would be taken. Many had no such luck. Civilian craft continued to slip in and out, some returning with fresh water and supplies, others making their final run under enemy fire. The courage displayed by the operators of these vessels was extraordinary. Samuel Wallace, a ferryman from Ramsgate, recounted steering through burning oil, dodging dead bodies, and eluding mines on his last rescue run. By dawn on June 4th, Admiral Ramsay declared Dynamo closed. The last boats departed. German tanks now roamed the outskirts and the beach, rounding up stragglers. Yet, against every odd, the evacuation had succeeded on a scale nobody had dared hope. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers, British, French, Belgians, and others, had crossed the Channel to safety. When Churchill addressed the House of Commons later that day, he did not spare the truth: wars are not won by evacuations. But a miracle had occurred, a disaster transformed, amid ruin and loss, into defiant hope. The aftermath of Dunkirk reverberated across Britain like a thunderclap. Train stations from Dover to London, and inland cities beyond, saw the quiet and bedraggled return of hundreds of thousands of men. Most arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs, boots stained with sand, faces gaunt from deprivation and battle. Crowds gathered, wives, mothers, children, strangers, to welcome home the survivors. For some, joy was muted by knowledge of those left behind or lost to the sea. The British government, stunned but relieved, scrambled to care for the huge influx. Hospitals and makeshift medical centers overflowed with wounded. Many soldiers required weeks, even months, of rest to recover from trauma and fatigue. In countless towns, stories began to circulate, of fishermen who braved fire, of Navy captains whose ships were sunk and who swam to safety, of entire battalions who vanished in action, their fate unknown. Not all was celebration. The Ministry of Information prepared the country for grim realities. Most equipment, vehicles, artillery, ammunition, had been abandoned on French soil, lost to the enemy. Britain's army was a force without weapons, but the men had survived. The press called it the miracle of Dunkirk, and Churchill purposely shaped the narrative for unity, urging perseverance, vowing that we shall never surrender. For the French, the memory was bittersweet. Many had fought to their last, holding the line for the escape of their allies. Many were now prisoners, facing an unfamiliar future in German captivity. Dunkirk's battered landscape bore silent witness to the sacrifice and chaos. Yet the evacuation changed global sentiment. In the United States and Commonwealth, sympathy and support swelled. The lesson learned: Britain could still fight, if only it possessed the will and the time. In the weeks following Dunkirk's last evacuation, the world watched nervously as France succumbed to the German advance. Paris fell on June 14th, and armistice followed days later. Yet, the spirit forged in the fires of Dunkirk did not die. Britain, battered but unbowed, rallied its citizenry for the battle to come. The narrative of Dunkirk spread, merging myth and reality. Journalists and ministers celebrated the little ships, and the countless civilians who, refusing orders, crossed into the deadly channel to save stranded soldiers. The heroic defense by French troops was remembered, though sorrow over abandonment remained in cross-channel relations. Still, the evacuation became a symbol of courage in defeat, of solidarity across ranks and nations, and of hope under overwhelming odds. Churchill's famous speech, delivered on June 4, 1940, became doctrine: "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be, we shall never surrender." The speech galvanized resistance, set the stage for the Battle of Britain, and sent a message to Hitler that England would not fall quietly. Dunkirk's beaches, left in ashes and silence, became holy ground for survivors and generations, proof that in the darkest hour, courage could ignite a spark that changed the course of war. For months, evaluated soldiers drilled and learned anew, prepared to face invasion, awaiting weapons and tanks. The world's fate depended on what came next. Dunkirk's legacy endures, a miracle forged in terror, a beacon to rally nations against tyranny. As the echoes of Dunkirk faded from the French coast, Europe staggered beneath the relentless advance of the Wehrmacht. The French High Command, shocked by the sudden loss of their northern armies and their British allies, struggled desperately to halt the German tide. Yet without the bulk of their forces, and as Italian armies opened a new front from the south on June 10, the fate of France was sealed. In Paris, Premier Paul Reynaud agonized over surrender. On June 14, German troops entered the city, the Eiffel Tower shrouded in gloom as swastika banners went up over government buildings. The French government fled south, ultimately signing an armistice on June 22, splitting the country into occupied and Vichy zones under strict Nazi oversight. Millions became refugees, fleeing with little hope, many remembering the chaos on the roads to Dunkirk just weeks before. In London, Churchill and the War Cabinet digested the grim news. The loss of France was not just military but strategic. Britain now stood alone, an island fortress, vulnerable to invasion, lacking heavy equipment and vehicles. Hitler's Luftwaffe began preparations for Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned assault across the Channel, with Dunkirk's beaches to serve as staging grounds. Yet, the spirit kindled at Dunkirk remained unbroken. With the army preserved, if not its hardware, Britain rallied. The government launched campaigns to collect medals and vehicles, urging civilians to join the fight. Factories converted to war production. The phrase Dunkirk spirit entered everyday language, grit in adversity became a badge of honor. A continent braced for the next storm, as the world soon realized Dunkirk's threads ran through every battlefield to come. The story of Dunkirk reverberated far beyond Britain's shores. In Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines spread the miraculous rescue. Sons and brothers were alive. Veterans who'd faced annihilation were now back on friendly soil. Prime ministers from Ottawa to Canberra offered new commitments. Canada prepared convoys to ferry men and supplies across the Atlantic. Australia's parliament vowed to bolster the empire with ships and squadrons, even as war clouds loomed in Asia. In India, Viceroy Lord Linlithgow declared, "Britain stands, so shall the empire." The United States, still officially neutral, was equally moved. Eyeing the staggering loss of equipment at Dunkirk, President Franklin D. Roosevelt accelerated efforts to aid the beleaguered British. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement, signed in September 1940, reflected lessons from Dunkirk, giving Britain vital ships to defend its shores in exchange for basing rights in British territories. America's arsenal of democracy was awakened, factories soon humming with tanks, planes, and trucks. A global network of hope, galvanized by Dunkirk, set the stage for a new kind of warfare, supply lines stretched across oceans, volunteers trained for battle, and leaders united in defiance. With Dunkirk's beaches now in German hands, Hitler turned his attention to the skies. The Luftwaffe sought to destroy the RAF and pave the way for invasion, Operation Sea Lion. Beginning in July 1940 and raging into the autumn, the air war over Britain and the Channel became the next crucible. RAF airfields, still staffed by pilots whose retreat from Dunkirk had steeled them for survival, were bombarded day after day. Fighter Command dispersed Spitfires and Hurricanes to key bases, Biggin Hill, Duxford, Hornchurch, often scrambling exhausted crews who had witnessed Dunkirk's chaos firsthand. Many pilots were fresh from the beaches, veterans of the ground war, now airborne to defend their homeland. British radar, refined in the weeks after Dunkirk to counter German tactics, provided early warning. Large swarms of Heinkel bombers and Messerschmitt escorts faced determined resistance. On August 15, dubbed the Greatest Day, both sides suffered heavy losses. Squadrons raided by Luftwaffe pilots who only months before watched British soldiers in retreat now fought for supremacy. Citizens remembered Churchill's promise, to fight in the air. Anti-aircraft batteries manned by volunteers, many rescued from Dunkirk, blazed skyward at distant bombers. Children and families huddled in London underground stations as the Blitz began, determined that the spirit of Dunkirk, forged in fire, would not waver. Across Europe, the world waited for Britain to fall, but the island held firm. Dunkirk's evacuation bought time, not just for the British Isles, but for the Empire's armies in distant lands. In North Africa, Allied forces under British General Archibald Wavell prepared for combat against the Italians and, soon, the notorious Afrika Korps led by Erwin Rommel. Supplies, men, and hope, preserved from Dunkirk, streamed into Alexandria and Cairo. Commonwealth uniforms, British Tommies, and Free French soldiers, some rescued from France, fanned out across the desert. The memory of Dunkirk was ever present. Desert columns used makeshift equipment, determined not to retreat but to hold every inch of sand. On June 10, as Italy entered the war, battles erupted along the Libyan and Egyptian frontiers. British units conducted lightning raids, even as Rommel's advance in 1941 threatened to turn the tide. Yet the spirit of Dunkirk persisted. Units cut off from supply, like the 7th Armored Division, fought desperate rearguard actions in El Agheila and Sidi Barani, refusing surrender. Dunkirk's ripple effect, its demonstration of resilience in adversity, became a rallying cry for the North African campaign. As desert storms swept across ancient battlefields, the resolve first forged on French beaches steeled every man facing the enemy beneath relentless sun. While Dunkirk played out in the West, the Soviet Union, cautious and watchful, learned vital lessons about mobility, resilience, and the potential for sudden reversal. Stalin, wary of Hitler's intentions despite the non-aggression pact, ordered large-scale reforms. Soviet generals, Timoshenko, Zhukov, studied Allied confusion and blitzkrieg's impact at Dunkirk, preparing new lines, redoubts, and vast reserves. Dunkirk's aftermath reverberated eastward as Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, betraying the uneasy truce. Soviet planners had noted how even a defeated army could survive to fight again, and thus prepared deep defensive belts, scorched earth tactics, even evacuation plans for cities at risk. When German forces surged across the frontier, incidents reminiscent of Dunkirk emerged, the encirclement of Soviet armies in Kiev, Smolensk, and the desperate rescue missions along the Dnieper. Unlike the BEF in 1940, many Soviet units could not escape. However, Dunkirk's lessons in improvisation and sacrifice were not forgotten. Red Army commanders adapted, urging soldiers to fight ferociously, to hold out for evacuation or relief instead of surrender. Across the vast Eurasian steppes, Dunkirk's ghost haunted the German high command. What if the Soviets, too, managed a miracle at the gates of Moscow or Stalingrad? While the guns fell silent on the sands of Dunkirk, the embers of resistance glowed in the shadows of occupied Europe. The miracle evacuation electrified disparate groups, French, Belgian, Dutch, and later Yugoslav and Polish networks, who saw that retreat need not lead to defeat. Radio London carried tales of Dunkirk nightly, its coded messages and hopeful proclamations kindling resilience among underground organizations. Inspired by the defiance of the trapped Allies, cells of the French resistance began to form, aided by the legendary SOE, Special Operations Executive, established in July 1940. Many SOE agents were veterans of the Dunkirk evacuation, men and women who had seen terror on the beaches and now dared even more dangerous missions behind enemy lines. They distributed leaflets, sabotaged railroads, and provided vital intelligence about German movements, relaying these secrets to London via clandestine transmissions. In Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Dunkirk's tale emboldened citizens to shelter fugitives, smuggle Allied airmen to safety, or, later, feed the clandestine market of escape lines funneling down to Spain. Each small act of rebellion echoed the spirit born at Dunkirk, the will to resist, no matter how dire the odds. German counterintelligence poured resources into crushing these Dynamo-inspired seeds, yet the idea that tyranny could be thwarted, even temporarily, persisted in every occupied city. As the years passed, Dunkirk's myth of rescue and survival would figure in great operations, Torch, Overlord, and countless special mission briefings, reminding new generations of clandestine warriors what courage seeded by hope could accomplish. Dunkirk had preserved an army, but left Britain's defense deeply reliant on the Atlantic lifeline, mighty convoys crossing hostile seas, stalked by Hitler's wolf packs. The Royal Navy, reflecting on lessons from Dynamo, revolutionized its convoy system. Small ships, the unsung heroes of Dunkirk, were repurposed for escort duty, their crews seasoned by battle and ready for the grinding war against the submarine menace. From summer 1940 through 41 and 42, the Battle of the Atlantic raged. German U-boats claimed thousands of Allied sailors, but every convoy that made it ashore brought tanks, trucks, fuel, and rations, all crucial for rebuilding the Army's strength after its bitter escape. Dunkirk's spirit infused these sailors, whether in inky black storms or under attack by torpedoes. The principle that life could be snatched from the jaws of disaster became a guiding ethos. Sailors and merchant mariners often received medals inspired by Dynamo's legacy, their sacrifice vital in the long attritional struggle. The United States, now fully at war after December 1941, sent Liberty ships by the hundreds, learning hard lessons about convoy routes, gunnery, and the value of quick repairs, just as Dunkirk's makeshift armada had salvaged desperate circumstances with ingenuity and speed. The Atlantic Bridge, linking continents, became the great artery of Allied survival, a direct consequence of the army rescued from Dunkirk's shore. Dunkirk's template of indomitability and retreat soon found echo in other harrowing Allied escapes, a second Dunkirk philosophy adopted wherever the tides of war turned volatile. In April 1941, as German panzers swept into Greece, British and Commonwealth troops, unable to stem the tide, conducted a series of desperate withdrawals, culminating in a mass evacuation from the beaches of Kalamata, often referred to as the Dunkirk of the Mediterranean. Here, too, the Royal Navy and an array of vessels pulled more than 50,000 Allied soldiers to safety, again under fierce air attack. Similarly, in December 1941, the rapid Japanese advance forced a chaotic retreat from Hong Kong and Malaya, evacuations inspired by memories of Dunkirk's improvisation, courage, and coordination. These weren't always successes. Many who could not be rescued perished or fell into captivity. Yet, Dunkirk's lesson lingered. Even when equipment and ground must be abandoned, the will and unity of the fighting force must be preserved. This ethos informed commanders throughout the war, not as an excuse for defeat, but as a strategic resource, a precious chance to regroup and fight on. Each miracle escape was costly, but the living memory of Dunkirk ensured that lost battles did not become lost wars. By 1943, Dunkirk's legacy transformed from survival to vengeance. The armies that had once waited hopeless on French sand regrouped, retrained, and were rearmed with American and Commonwealth-provided weaponry. Tales of the old BEF's plight forged the backbone of new units, especially as the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, November 1942, and then Italy, Operation Husky, July 1943, shifted momentum. Veterans who had stumbled off the beaches now spearheaded assaults on Tobruk, Tunis, Sicily, Anzio, eventually Normandy. Remember Dunkirk became a battle cry, not merely for rescue, but for never again allowing themselves to be encircled or defeated without a fight. In D-Day briefings, commanders cited Dunkirk as the nadir, to which Allies would never return. When the Normandy beaches erupted with smoke and gunfire on June 6, 1944, a new generation of soldiers passed through the same waters that had once been scenes of despair. But this time, the Allies charged forward, their home shores behind them, secure thanks to the miracle at Dunkirk, and their objective clear: liberation. As the guns quieted in May 1945 and the world took stock of its agony and triumph, Dunkirk stood not as a site of defeat, but as a wellspring of inspiration. The battered port and now quiet beaches became a place of pilgrimage, British and French dignitaries gathering in annual commemoration of the selfless stand and astonishing rescue. Museums were built, stories collected of every small boat on the channel, and men who once crouched in the dunes returned with families to trace their ordeal, but also their deliverance. Churchill's words, "We shall fight on the beaches," were inscribed on memorials and in school curriculums. Songs, novels, and films celebrated the civilian mariners, the RAF's invisible shield, and the stubborn resolve of rearguard actions. In military academies from Sandhurst to West Point, Dunkirk became a lesson: never underestimate morale, logistics, and the willpower of ordinary people. Its survival legacy informed planners in Korea, at Dien Bien Phu, and even in distant Afghanistan, proof that courage in crisis can rewrite the narrative of war. Dunkirk's lasting message is not mere retreat, but the power to transform defeat into resistance, chaos into myth, and despair into hope. It remains, for all time, a defining moment, a nation's soul rescued from oblivion and a proof point that the darkest hour often precedes the dawn.